Paul said, they were supporting the big, what came to be called Big Australia, was supporting a very generous migration policy. Also trying to build up, there's the mission of the Australians, national affairs, so trying to build up political coverage, business coverage, the arts, as Warren mentioned. The economic coverage, the foreign affairs coverage, which is terribly important to the Australian, and even in the end, trying to build up sport. But
did that have its particular difficulties because of the nature of sport in Australia?
Yeah, because it was all fragmented in the winter. Yes.
Special editions.
We came to take eventually AFL seriously, and we were aided by the fact that rugby league became kind of national. But we appointed some very senior people in Melbourne and in sports writers, and we worked very closely with the AFL to find a role for the Australian. This is different from the state-based papers. And we even though News Limited owned Super League at the time, we gave preference to AFL over rugby league.
But this goes to the sort of schizophrenic nature of the paper at times, doesn't it? Because there were times where there were split editions, yes. AFL for the southern states and League for the northern states. Well, hello, national paper, that goes diametrically opposed to the concept.
That's right. That's right.
Could I just throw in there on the sporting side, from its inception, the Australian was always very strong on racing.
Yes. And
covered racing in all the states, replating for Victoria and Brisbane and so on. And it was costing a small fortune. And during my editorship, when the pressure was on costs, I was compelled to drop the racing section back to bare bones. And I argued that this was going to cost us a lot of circulation, and I was told, well, it'll be the C demographic, and you won't really lose much circulation anyway. Well, we lost 6,000 copies a day on each day, and in a circulation it was then about 120. That was quite a significant drop in circulation.
But what was the cost benefit? I mean, how much did you save by eliminating all those people and all that work?
Well, newsprint, we went from about 3 pages down to 1 generally. Staffing, I'm not sure that we lost any staff at that stage. They were moved around. Well, it must have been deemed significant for it to be done, but I'm not quite sure about that.
Yeah. Michelle, how do you see your role as editor?
Well, getting back to your question mark about, how you focus on the day-to-day and also on the horizon, I think actually Noel Pearson is going to make some remarks at our 50th, which is coming up in a few weeks, and whilst I wouldn't talk about what remarks he's going to make in broad terms, he does make a comment in which he said the Australian's always been a paper that focuses on the here and now but has one eye on the horizon. And I think that Paul captured that also in his address this morning. And I think we do walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think, and it's evident in Paul's comments about fair and probing reporting, the extent to which we do take being a paper of record seriously. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, and it's particularly evident in our inquiry section in the weekend paper I edit, for example, having your vision also on those values that Rupert defined for the paper in the very beginning, and pursuing, I guess, some would say campaigning on those issues that are close to the newspaper's heart, safe Indigenous affairs. So I think we aim, as Paul said this morning, to do both, and I think that's something you tussle with, day in, day out when you're putting a paper together.
Your focus, though, of course, is on one edition a week, isn't it? Does that give you a different...
I edited yesterday, and so, you know, some weeks I do edit a couple of papers during the week, but my primary job is the Saturday paper.
And is it easier or harder to sit there on a Monday or Tuesday and say, this is what we'll plan to do on Saturday and it might be read on Sunday?
Yeah, look, it's a dream job in Australian journalism because you do have time to think. You know, if Clive's taking care of the Monday to Friday paper with Chris, and I've got days to plan, it's fantastic. Now, sometimes you junk those plans. Sometimes you have a great idea on a Monday, which by a Thursday looks not so good, and you start again. But it's fantastic with a section like Inquirer, for example. Inquirer, you know, does bounce out of, I think even now more than ever, does bounce out of the week's events. So often on a Thursday we won't know what the cover of Inquirer is necessarily, but then other weeks we'll have an investigative news agenda that someone like Hedley Thomas is pursuing, and we'll commission him to aim for a front page news story and also to see if he can enlarge upon it for Inquirer. So yeah, it's great because you've actually got that time to plan.
You mentioned Hedley, and you're a current editor, so I'll pop this one up here. What's the context in which the series of Clive Palmer stories are coming up? Has Chris or Rupert or anybody said get Palmer, or just how is this happening?
No, not to my knowledge. I mean, the thing that most people would know about Hedley Thomas, those of you who know him, is he's not one who's easily directed. Hedley, whether it's Hanif, whether it's the Wivenhoe Dam coverage, whether it's, you know, anything he's done over the past 10 years, he doesn't need much encouragement once he decides that there's a yarn there and he wants to pursue it. So with Clive Palmer, Hedley decided to take a good look at him. We would say that was a pretty sound thing to do, given what would eventuate. And of course Clive now, together with his senators, holding the balance of power, is a very, very important position in Australian politics. So no, we had a look and we've kept looking. And, you know, in a way, it's very surprising to us that our competitors haven't been looking so hard, given that a lot of Hedley's reporting, particularly in recent months, stems from court documents. It's civil court action that CITIC, a Chinese company, has taken to recover funds that it believes are rightfully so Hedley's reporting recently is driven by court reporting and documents in both Western Australia and Queensland. So it's pretty standard reporting. It's just that he knows what rocks to look under.
Yes, I think this is often the case, isn't it? You start a ball rolling and you never know where it'll go, and you've just got to keep following it. And I think that was best exemplified by Watergate. Follow the money. There is a perception, I think, in the public, if not shared by all media, that Rupert Murdoch, who is central to the story of the Australian, calls the shots. And I would agree with Paul that in my initial time, Rupert explained in quite simple terms where he wanted to take the paper and why. But I want to ask each of the editors about this perception of the all-powerful Murdoch proprietorial intervention, editorial instructions, or interference on the day-to-day operations of the paper. Let's start with you, Warren. Was Rupert an ever-present force telling you what to do?
When I was bureau chief in Canberra from 75 to 78, he was a weekly telephone visitor.
Where was he? London?
Wherever, London, America. You never knew where Rupert was. Could have been in Sydney for all I knew. Generally inquiring what was going on, particularly through the period when supply had been denied, he was forever wondering how Labor was holding up, how Liberals were holding up, how Fraser was going. At the time we had a very forceful old chairman called Sir Kenneth May, who used to give Rupert his daily briefing on what was going on, and Sir Kenneth, I think it's safe to say, was far right. Further right.
Genghis Khan, right? He was from Adelaide.
So usually when Rupert would call to inquire, he'd already had this right-wing view of what was happening in the world. I can only recall one occasion when he questioned what I was. Two occasions when he questioned what I was doing. One of them was simply over the layout of the paper and his perception that the headlines were too big. And Mark points out to me that he used to say the same thing when Mark was on the Mirror.
Yeah, but the next breath was, show more bigger.
And the other one was, I think it was 1980, when Peacock was gearing up for a challenge to Malcolm Fraser. We had a correspondent in Canberra then by the name of Russell Snyder, who was well connected with the Liberal Party and had an inside running on the thing. And I'm sure Rupert was getting the word from Malcolm Fraser via Sir Kenneth every day that this mounting pressure was a myth, and he kept on. Rupert would call it, once a week and say, what's this Peacock business? What's going on? And eventually, when the challenge happened and Peacock was defeated, I never heard from Rupert. He was always questioning whether we were getting it right and never conceding when we did.
I think we've all got yarns like that, but in summary, was Rupert there pulling the strings?
No, he wasn't.
David, were you a puppet?
People say that Rupert only appoints editors who agree with him. That he had to have some kind of Thatcherite, Reaganite view of the world, and that's why he appoints them. As though this is some blinding insight, as though the Guardian would appoint a Tory as editor, or the New York Times would appoint a Republican. Rupert, I think, does pick people who he knows shares the vision of the paper, who understand the vision of the paper, and who probably generally, in their approach to national affairs, share certain values to greater or lesser degree. Excuse me. And those are mainly values about an open competitive economy and those sorts of things. But you don't have to be what's the word? A hard and fast 100% true blue Thatcherite to qualify. You have to have a certain general view, I think, of the way the world works and the paper's position in that world. And then, as Paul said, you just get on with the job. Rupert rang me once to discuss what we're going to be saying editorially.
Over what period of time?
Oh, that's about 8 or 9 years.
Yeah.
And that was with the Paul Keating's first challenge against Bob Hawke, and he asked who we were going to support. So I went into this long-winded explanation of everything and all the factors of play and so on. And he said, yes, but who are we going to support? And I said, Keating. I said, Keating. And he said, OK, we've got no problems then. That was it.
Yeah.
Mind you, there's a qualification of that is that when I was editor-in-chief, we had Lachlan. We had Lachlan as our chief executive, and maybe some of the things that, just maybe, some of the things that Lachlan had to say were inspired by overnight conversations with Rupert. But they were mainly criticisms when Lachlan thought, and this is why you think it must go back to Rupert, Lachlan thought we were being too socially liberal. He thought we were playing. We get some snide remarks, but we were playing to the Oxford Street crowd a bit too much. And he just said, that's got to be Rupert initially.
If I could just tell a story there. in my period, both as editor of the Sunday Mail Adelaide, the Daily Mirror, Truth and the Australian, there were only a couple of occasions where Rupert told me what he wanted. One of them was November 11, 1975. He was in Sydney and I was editing the Mirror on the day the announcement came through that Kerr had sacked Gough. They were at lunch in the boardroom and I just barged in and imparted the news. And there was that, you know, the silence you get on a satellite thing, 2.3 seconds. You wait, boom, 2.3. And Ken Malin out of mud, he whoopee, and threw his napkin up in the air. Rupert didn't say a word, he just rushed past me to his office, whereupon no doubt he hit the phone. Later in the afternoon he came around and he said, right, let's have an editorial tomorrow. More in sorrow than in anger, Whitlam must go. So I said, very well, Rupert, thank you. So I sat down there and I did a 600-word editorial, which ended more in sorrow than in anger. Whitlam must go. That was published the next day. There was a protest in Hyde Park. The protesters marched on Holt Street, tore copies of the Mirror off the trucks down in the street, set them on fire, and I said, the power of words. There we are. It was pretty willing stuff, but that was the only time I ever got an instruction from Rupert on exactly what to say in an editorial. Does Rupert hit the phone every week and have a chat, tell you what to say, pull your strings?
No, I mean, look, Chris Mitchell has the relationship with Rupert, speaks to him regularly, no doubt. But, you know, on the 4 or 5 occasions I've met Rupert, the thing that I think distinguishes him is his curiosity. He asks a lot more questions than he, you know, he asks a heap of questions about what's going on in Australia, about politicians, about public policy, about this and that. And so no, I mean, I've only met Rupert 4 or 5 times, but I had some great conversations with him, and he asks more than he, you know, lectures.
So is it right, therefore, to say that this perception of Murdochian interference is not true, that by all means there is a Murdochian influence more by osmosis rather than direct action? Do we agree with that?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. But it varies. I used to spend a bit of time in London talking to our UK colleagues at the time, and he would be much more actively intervening there, and much on the phone for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 times a week to the editors in London, and discussing issues and issuing directives. And I think, you know, maybe it's not a great virtue on his part. He's just more concerned about what goes on in the bigger capitals of the world and than what goes on in Australia.
And yet the Oz has always been regarded as his baby, and he's said that, and many occasions we've commented that we'd love to earn Rupert's annual phone bill, because it doesn't matter where he is, he knows the time zone and he's on the phone.
And he'll find you.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. How do you view the Australians' competitors? Did the Australian always march to its own tune, or was it influenced by what others did? We'll start with your era, Warren.
Very, very much we marched to our own tune. The Sydney Morning Herald was not our only competitor. We regarded the Financial Review as a significant competitor because of the emphasis that we put on business reporting. But I always thought the Sydney Morning Herald was a bit all over the place. Talking to David earlier, he mentioned that the Sydney Morning Herald lost sight of its constituency on the North Shore and swayed back to issues that affected the West and the outer areas more. On occasions it tried to be the national paper and then contracted to be the state paper competing with the Telegraph. And I think that was its problem. It wasn't quite sure whether it was competing with the Telegraph or the Australian. And in my view it should have consistently competed with the Australian.
the Australian should compete with?
The Sydney Morning Herald should have consistently competed with the Australian, rather than be preoccupied every now and then with the Telegraph, which had the bigger circulation, of course.
David, did you keep an eye on the competition?
We keep an eye on the competition. The trouble is the competition was everyone. The competition was the Sydney Morning Herald, Financial Review, The Age, the Courier Mail, the Adelaide Advertiser and so on. So you couldn't afford to be focusing on what everyone else was doing all the time. So even if you didn't want to, you'd just naturally be marching to your own drum. Besides, we did have a fairly clear vision of what we thought the paper should be doing, and didn't allow yourself to get distracted by what the Sydney Morning Herald was thinking or what the Age was thinking. And they had their own problems. You know, the loss of circulation in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age dates. This is when the graph really starts coming down. It predates the internet. They're having issues before the internet came along. I once did an exercise in the late 80s, and I forget exactly when, but how the Liberals decided to do a mid-term election campaign and put a lot of advertising money into newspapers and television. And they gave no money to the Daily Telegraph. Took no ads in the Daily Telegraph. So I got the circulation people to show me, well, it's effectively a circulation map of Sydney. And there are two Sydneys. If you drop down from Hornsby to about Strathfield and across to Randwick, Coogee, Sydney Morning Herald territory. Everything west and south of that was Daily Telegraph territory, and really very, very clearly so. Now, I pointed this out to Howard's office, and we got some money to the Daily Telegraph for those Southern Beach electorates. They saw the wisdom of that. But the other point is, there's a stage at which the Sydney Morning Herald became maybe even hostile to the conservative values of that North Shore constituency, and just dropped them off and concentrated far more on that sort of arc in the west out to the beach suburbs. And that's a fine thing to do if you want to support those issues. I'm not arguing with it, but it does rather limit your ability to sell newspapers.
And Michelle, I shouldn't ask you this question because it's blindingly obvious that you keep a very close eye on what's happening at Fairfax. You only got to read cut and paste on a daily basis.
Yeah, we get some fodder for cut and paste from our competitors for sure. But I think there's never been a greater difference between, perhaps, I mean, others might disagree, but I think the difference between ourselves and our competitors is more stark than ever. And I think that because Chris has fostered very much a news-breaking culture on the paper where we judge ourselves by how many exclusives we have on the front every day. You don't want to wake up and see that the front of the Sydney Morning Herald, and now even the Age, nor the Fin Review, as David said, we compete with everyone, including our state-based News Corp papers. And a good day for us is when our page one is dominated by yarns no one else has. Or indeed, you know, in the recent, for example, the Clive Palmer Gore situation, where you have a story where everybody is going to look at it. We're pretty proud of our reporting effort on that, where we kind of exposed, if you like, the what was really going on there, and Fairfax did not. So I think, yes, we keep an eye on them, of course, but we run our own race very much so, and that's how we like it.
Because in the early days, the real problem was for the Australian to be noticed in the capitals, particularly outside Sydney, because you know there was such a tradition. The audiences of the Age and the Herald Sun and the Advertiser were so rusted on that we had to offer something different or just be lost. And I agree. Chris Mitchell's #1 policy is breaking news. Guess what? Newsflash. So was ours back in 1975. If we couldn't be reporting something different or in a different manner,
Yeah.
we were utterly lost. You had to know what your opposition was doing, but then you had to forget what they were doing and do something which was an umbrella right across the top and relevant right across the nation.
Yeah.
And there were periods where this was tackled by special editions. There was a special edition for Victoria for a while. There was a little digger wraparound, first in Canberra and then in Queensland. Well, these attacked the very core of the notion that we're a national paper. And the Queensland one actually did work. It built circulation by 15,000, 20,000, much of which hung on after it went. But it was still a core conundrum back then, and to an extent still now, to how to be different when your competition is everybody else.
That's absolutely right. And for a lot of our history in capital cities, we were very much a second buy, as you're alluding to there. And we did, I remember 10, 15 years ago, we did a lot more strip-ins. We'd have a column 8 story on page 3 and 5, and we'd change it 5 times and have a different story in that same spot for the 5 different states. We did that a lot. We did have the offer in Melbourne where we had a Victorian page, or sometimes double page there for a little while. I don't think it worked tremendously well, but David...
That didn't work, but cutting the price did.
Yeah, that's true, and they went in tandem, didn't they?
Yeah, we cut the price in half in Melbourne, and we took the circulation in Melbourne from about 22,000 to 23,000 to about 48,000.
Yeah.
And then when we put the price back, down to 30-something. So it's about a 50% increase that lasted for some time. I don't know how long, because
But this was an experiment taken straight out of Fleet Street, wasn't it? Yes. Where in that period the Fleet Street papers were halving their prices and even cutting them by 2/3 for what was really fountain effect sales, like bingo, to go through the roof, and as soon as you stopped or went back to normal, it just settled back there. So they were high-priced sales in promotional terms, or costly promotional terms. Now, we've been going for an hour, and you've been very attentive, but you haven't asked any questions. Could we take some questions before we start summing up? Catherine?
Thanks. Catherine Mumby. The question I have, and I say this as someone who was a journalist. I haven't been reading academic captivity, so I certainly don't have an I don't come from a position of opposition to Australia, and I take the point about its very proud history. And I think it was interesting that Paul Kelly talked in his speech quite a lot about the intellectual tradition of the Australian. And I think it was seen as, even though I was at Fairfax, I think it was seen as a paper that did have a strong intellectual tradition, and has always been an excellent paper. What I'd like some comment on is, over the past, I would say probably 5 years, there is a perception among, I think, what we might call intellectuals, so not just academics, but people who are writers or cultural commentators, that when it comes to, I guess, coverage of intellectual debates in a whole range of areas, including education and tertiary education, that there's been an anti-intellectual turn in some of the Australians' commentary, and that there, well, let me be blunt, that some of the sorts of commentators who are championing really are not, I guess, first-rate intellects. They're not enough, and that there is some, I guess, there's become a kind of a breach between what you might call the intellectual classes and the Australian. There's not enough dialogue.
Okay, Michelle, you're there. You're current.
I thought you might come to me.
Your response.
I'm glad you did.